Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much for that welcome. I feel looking around me that I've arrived in Athens, and that makes me feel very comfortable because of the Greeks and their fascination with science. You've asked me to speak to you on the question that I find the hardest of all. Each one of us, whatever his or her worldview, finds the problem of pain and suffering and evil an extremely difficult one. And I do not want you to think at the outset that I feel that I've got a set of simplistic answers. What I wish to share with you are ways in which I approach this question that I have found increasingly helpful in my life. You will realize, of course, that the problem of suffering and evil has two sides. Cancer looks like one thing through the eyes of the oncologist. It looks very different through the eyes of the young woman of 25 who's just been told that she has a few months to live. There is an intellectual side to the question because our minds want reason and meaning. There is also a pastoral side to the question because many of us may well be hurting and we have questions that go beyond our human resource to cope with. So I'm going to try to do what is really impossible and difficult tonight, is to combine both of those sides. And you will forgive me if I don't go into much detail, but I hope it will begin to open avenues of thought and indeed hope for some of you. Now, yesterday I visited the 9/11 Memorial Garden. I slowly went round the pools, read some of the 3,000 names beautifully engraved in bronze, around that large waterfall which cascades in a square form into an abyss, and then it moves into the center, it tumbles into an abyss, and you cannot see where it goes. And it evoked in my mind powerful symbolism. My mind flashed back to 11 years ago as I watched in utter horror from my position in Germany at the time as the towers fell into the ground and that stream of dust and debris and twisted steel and humanity poured into the earth, never to return from it. And 9/11 is seared into all the memories of those old enough at the time to understand what was happening. A horrific, callous, evil act that brought grief and still brings it to thousands of families, deprived thousands of their partners, their fathers, their mothers, their children, their relatives, their friends, their colleagues and their neighbors. It led to acts of memorable heroism. Who will ever forget the selfless actions of the New York firefighters and police? It was an attack upon a nation, and its sheer magnitude has made it difficult to process for many people, especially maybe some of you who do not really remember it. 9/11 raises in an acute form the problem of evil. And I've received a number of questions, as you've heard, from Columbia students. And the most prominent among them is the word why. And some say 9/11 shows, if we needed to be shown, that there is no God. But I did something else today. I switched on the television channel and watched for several hours and listened to the names of the people being read out. Listened to relatives describe their love for their lost husband or wife or girlfriend or colleague. And I was struck, very struck, by the many clear assertions of faith in God and his love, and the hope that it gave to those left behind. In fact, what was particularly moving was that the people did not speak about their relatives and friends as if they no longer existed. They spoke not about them, but they spoke to them. I love you, Dad. That went to my heart as a dad. What must it be like to gaze at those holes in the ground and realize that your son was buried there and you will never see him again? But what was even more striking in this was that I didn't hear a single tinge of atheism from those who were immediately involved in suffering bereavement. Now, it may be that 9/11 has been eclipsed for many of you by more immediate problems than the suffering caused by terrorism. In a crowd like this, there will be many who are suffering their own private horror. Whether it's the horror inflicted on you by somebody else, or whether it's disease or illness or some natural catastrophe that fills your entire horizon. I can remember the day my brother was blown up by a terrorist bomb and nearly lost his life. I haven't had that experience myself, but I've been near to it. And those things are so real, because in the end, the suffering that we are most concerned with is our suffering and our pain. And it gets more remote as it fades into the past and is the suffering and pain of others. So this is what we call the problem of evil and suffering, and we all face it. And I'm a scientist, and I like to analyze things and take them to pieces and understand how they work. And there's been some very interesting work in psychiatry and psychology recently by Ian McGilchrist, arguing how the two sides of the human brain work. Now, this has been, in a sense, for years common knowledge, that the left side of the brain is concerned with analysis, concerned with reducing things, concerned with explanation, concerned with science. But McGilchrist's thesis is this: that human beings are so made from the perspective of science that they have two halves to their brain. And what we've done since the 17th century is to neglect the right side of the brain, which is concerned not with breaking down and reducing and analyzing, but concerned with integrating and finding meaning and discovering a big picture into which life fits. And that fascinates me because it's coming from a scientific discipline. It's saying that's the way we humans are. And so we are in peril if we simply concentrate on the side of scientific analysis. And that's why tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to be speaking in terms so much of scientific and forensic analysis. I want to address the right brain question. Why? How can we fit this into a worldview that makes sense, but above all gives us some kind of hope and perspective? Now, suffering comes to us from two logically distinct sources. The first is the moral evil for which men and women are themselves responsible, like 9/11. The second is the kind of suffering that doesn't come from human beings: natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, and cancer. And this is often called natural evil. So there are those two kinds. They're often entwined, and they very much belong together in our consideration. At the intellectual level, the most famous response to suffering comes from David Hume, the philosopher. Epicurus's questions are yet unanswered, he writes. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? I will never forget sitting talking to two Jewish acquaintances And we started talking about God, and before I'd gone very far, they said, look, just stop a minute. We don't believe in God. And there's no point in talking about God to us. And I said, why? And they said, we don't want to tell you. Because you seem a nice chap and we don't want to offend you. Well, I said, I may or may not be a nice chap. But if my faith cannot meet objections and difficulties, it's not worth believing in. Why don't you believe in God? And eventually they told me, they said they read out loud together, and they were reading a book by a famous Nobel Prize-winning literature Bashevitz singer who wrote a book called The Slave. And in it he described how some women and children were buried alive in a Russian pogrom. And I think it's in the book it says, I can forgive God anything but not that. And they said at that moment the light went out. There was no God, and we haven't believed in him since. I've stood in Auschwitz many times, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not ashamed to tell you I have wept every time, as I saw the horror of the Holocaust and what it left. Now, to many people, when they see 9/11, when they see the Holocaust, when they see their own personal suffering, they say, well, there isn't any God, and that's it. That's the finish. And it seems to them that they've got rid of the problem. But does atheism get rid of the problem? Let's just think about that for a moment. I was in New York just 3 weeks ago to appear on the Charlie Rose Show, of which some of you may have heard. It will be aired next week, I think, with Richard Dawkins, the world's most famous atheist, whom I've debated 3 times before. Now, here is his left-brained analysis of the question of suffering and evil. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe has exactly those properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. We're the suicide bombers of 9/11. We're the architects of the killing fields of Cambodia and in Rwanda, simply dancing to the music of their DNA. Is that all there is to the massacres of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Pol Pot? And if you felt like cutting babies to pieces for fun, would that simply be dancing to your DNA? If Dawkins is right, ladies and gentlemen, then evil and good do not exist, which strikes me as being very odd for a man who will condemn 9/11 and everything else as being evil, and quite rightly so. But he himself appears to believe that there is no such thing. This is one extreme atheistic response to the problem. It's essentially to deny that there's any good or any evil. We are simply robots, pre-programmed to follow our genetic inclinations. But Dawkins, like the rest of us, is outraged by evil in spite of his philosophy. But outrage, which we often rightly feel, presupposes that there exists a standard of good that is objectively real and independent of us, so that we expect others to agree with us in condemning things like 9/11. But if all that exists is mass energy, if there is no transcendence and no God, how can there be such a standard of good? And if there is no moral evil or good in any case, the concept of morality disappears and moral outrage is absurd. Many leading thinkers agree with this. Charles Taylor, the leading thinker about secularism, says the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. The irony to my mind is the very morality that atheists use to condemn 9/11 is in the Bible itself. And Thomas Jefferson recognized this. God who gave us life gave us liberty, he said. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God? I would like to suggest to you, if for whatever reason we lose faith in God, our future is bleak, because we will not be able to defend the freedoms we value on the basis of the moral relativism that remains when we lose our anchor in God. No secular morality was able to withstand Stalin, Hitler, or Mao, and no secular morality will withstand secularism or religious fanaticism today. Friedrich Nietzsche saw more clearly than anybody else the consequences of abandoning traditional biblical morality that is at the heart of our Western civilization and on which all our human rights conceptions and legislations are based. Nietzsche predicted that the death of God would lead to a Darwinian imperative of expressing the will to power. The strong must eliminate the weak. The biblical prohibition, "Thou shalt not kill," he wrote, is a piece of naivete. Life itself recognizes no solidarity, no equal rights between the healthy and the degenerate parts of an organism. One must excise the latter, or the whole will perish. Nietzsche despised Christian morality as that of slaves, and pointed out the death of God would mean the death of compassion, kindness, and forgiveness. When one gives up Christian belief, he wrote, one deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendental. It possesses truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with the belief in God. And then he asked the key question: why morality at all, when life, nature, history are non-moral? And yet there is morality. Absolute standards exist. I dare say and hope that all of us agree that torturing infants is wrong. And the prominent atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie says ethics constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. If then there are such moral values, they make, listen to this now, this is an atheist philosopher. If moral values exist, they make the existence of God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus we have, after all, a defensible argument from the existence of morality to the existence of God. So the situation looks to me like this. We all find ourselves to be moral beings. We're outraged by 9/11. We're outraged by things that happen to us and to our friends. The existence of such objective standards is consistent with the existence of God and very difficult to explain without him. But the existence of God gives rise to the problem of evil. And some of you might want to break in and say, but look, isn't it obvious that God's part of the problem, not the solution? I hear from your accent that you're from Northern Ireland. Doesn't Northern Ireland give the lie to any possibility of God helping us in this problem? Look at you, fighting in the name of God against each other. I admit I do come from Northern Ireland. What do I say to the fact that professing Christians in my own country have got involved in terrorism so that even my own brother was nearly blown into eternity? Do you know what I say about it, ladies and gentlemen? I am completely ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed that the name of Jesus Christ has ever been associated with violence. But I want to tell you why I'm ashamed of it. Because people that take up weapons to follow Jesus Christ are not obeying him, they're disobeying him. He explicitly told his followers not to fight. And he told Pilate, the Roman governor, when he was put on trial for what? It may interest you to know, if you don't know the history, that Jesus was tried for fomenting political terrorism. And when Pilate discovered and listened to Jesus say, "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting," Pilate realized that he was innocent. What was his kingdom about? It wasn't about fighting. "To this end I was born," he said, "and to this end I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth." And Pilate then knew that there was no danger, political or violence-wise, from this man. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it must be obvious to you that the one thing you cannot do by violence is to impose truth, especially if that truth conveys the way in which people can be forgiven and have peace with God and enjoy a very close and intimate relationship with God. Now, of course, other religions must speak for themselves on this matter of violence. I come from Ireland. I am a Christian, so I face it from this perspective. But there is another side to this, ladies and gentlemen. You've all heard the song that people like to sing, and Dawkins quotes it, by John Lennon. "Imagine a world with no Taliban. Imagine a world with no religion, with no Northern Ireland." I don't know how people can imagine a world without Northern Ireland, but there we are. Imagine that world, and I agree with a lot of its sentiments. But I notice that what Dawkins does not say is imagine a world without Stalin, imagine a world without Hitler, imagine a world without Pol Pot, the leaders of 3 militantly atheistic regimes. There is no excuse for 1 liter of blood that flowed in the name of religion in history. But the millions of liters of blood that have flowed in the name of secularist atheist ideologies beggar description. Alexander Solzhenitsyn stood in this country years ago, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, "If you asked me what was it that led to 60 million of my fellow citizens dying, he said, the answer is this: we have forgotten God." And many a Russian, because I spent a lot of time there, has said to me, "Do you know, Professor Lennox, we thought that we could get rid of God and preserve a value for human beings. We found we couldn't." And so in this contemporary secular society, we need to think about these things. But it's just at this point that atheism, that worldview, seems to me to face another great difficulty, the problem of justice. We all feel that we should get justice, but the fact is not everybody does. Indeed, for over the centuries, probably most people have never got justice. And in the atheist worldview, death is the end, so they will never get justice. The promised utopia has never come. And that is one of the factors to put into the equation. How can you possibly believe in justice in the light of the fact that the vast majority of people will never get justice? And of course, the terrorists get away with it. When Hitler sees he's against a wall, he blows his brains out. And since there is no justice, there is no judgment, there is no assessment, because death ends everything, he's got away with it. That is a moral affront to our being and our moral sense. So what I want to say to you tonight is this: that biblical monotheism, shared at this level by the 3 great monotheistic religions, says the exact opposite. It says, yes, there are absolute values. There is a moral law, but there is a lawgiver. God is behind the law, and he will be his vindicator, because there will be a final judgment when perfect justice will be done. Now, this is not the justice of an angry God. I'm amazed that I meet so many people that think that God is angry. Listen, God created you with all your wonderful gifts of artistry. He painted the universe. The only thing that gets God angry is the thing that destroys life. Let's call it by its name, it's sin. But God painted all the colors. We've never invented a new one. And we need to get away from this picture. It's precisely because God is a God of love, who loves the creatures he created, that in the end he must do justice, that we may see that justice is being done, and that it is not a mockery, and that our intuitions and consciences actually are backed up by something real. Now, many people reject the notion of judgment. I don't like a God like that, they say to me. But then they protest at moral evil and say, why doesn't God stop that? That's very interesting. Why doesn't he stop that so long as he doesn't intervene in my life? But you know, none of us can realistically discuss this problem without realizing that we're not just spectators of a phenomenon extraneous to ourselves. G.K. Chesterton, the famous novelist, was once asked to reply to the London Times to answer the question, what is wrong with the world? And his famous reply was the shortest letter in history. Dear sir, I am, yours faithfully, G.K. Chesterton. He was honestly prepared to say openly what we all know in our heart. There's evil in each one of us. We're part of the problem. And once we grasp this fact, a more realistic formulation would be, I think and do evil. If then there is a God, why does he tolerate me? Now the questions come thick and fast. Why does God allow suffering if there is a God? Surely if he's all-powerful, he could have created us without the capacity for moral evil. Well, of course he could. God could have made beings without the capacity for moral evil. In fact, there are a huge lot of them. They're animals. We can create beings that don't do evil. They're robots. But they're not human beings. I'm glad I do not have a robotic wife. If I went home and pressed the screen and it came up on my wife's, in front here, the screen came up with press number 1 for kiss. I press number 1 and I get a kiss. Well, that would not be meaningful, would it? But she wouldn't sin. She'd never do anything wrong. But she couldn't love me. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, this capacity to do evil is the flip side of the capacity to do good. And that is associated with the capacity to love, to say yes or no. It's associated with one of the most magnificent things about us, and that is the fact we possess, to a certain degree, freedom of will and choice. And if free will is real, as I believe it is, and most of us do, the last thing we like to be told is, you did that because you're an Irishman, or whatever it is. You're a woman, you're a man. No, we like to think we did it because we chose to do it. In other words, our dignity, our humanity consists in that succession of choices that we have made and still make that makes us us. This is, to my mind, a magnificent gift of God. But it has correlatives. As C.S. Lewis pointed out, if God created the world so that a beam of wood remained solid when I used it to build a house and bent in two when I used it to hit you, it would in the end render choice impossible. We would be forced into an automatic universe. Evil thoughts, he says, would be impossible, for the cerebral matter of our brain would refuse to carry them. It would only convey good thoughts, and so on. So God took a risk. Let's face it. God took a risk in creating such beings. I've got 3 children. I took a risk in bringing them into the world, didn't I? I remember holding the first child and thinking, this child could grow up to love me or say no to me. I've brought it into the world. Why did I take the risk? Aren't you glad somebody brought you into the world? Now, your experience of parental love may be very different. But it is an amazing thing that even though we know as parents there's a possibility of it going wrong, we still open ourselves up to love. We do that in all of our relationships. But you say, look, that argument of free will doesn't apply to natural disasters. I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And if you want to see what I said, the many TV and radio interviews, you can Google my name in New Zealand under the word earthquake, and you will find out. But I just want to say this. It's a very strange situation because tectonic plates that are responsible for earthquakes are essential to life. If there were no tectonic plates, you would not be alive because there wouldn't be enough carbon dioxide, and a lot of various processes that happen in the world would not occur. So on the one hand, they're necessary for life, but on the other hand, they destroy life if we build houses above them. Earthquakes are big things, but they're little earthquakes. 4 years ago, I had an earthquake in my heart. I was given a few minutes to live. That concentrates your mind. I said goodbye to my wife. I thought I'd never see her again when the operating theatre closed. And 40 minutes later, the surgeon said, well, I don't understand it, you should be dead. But you're not, you can go home tomorrow. And I'm here. And you say, well, you're a Christian, you thank God for that. Yes, I do, but listen. In the very same year, my 22-year-old niece had an earthquake in her brain. And it killed her. And her young husband watched her die. And I had to come and watch her die and talk to them. All very well, isn't it, for me to say, yes, God help you. But if I had nothing to say to my sister, then I'd better keep quiet, hadn't I? And that seems to me, and forgive me for being personal, but these things are personal and real. They give rise to questions like this. Could God have made electricity that wasn't dangerous? Could he have made fire that didn't burn? Could he have made a world without tectonic plates, without predation, without bacteria? Could God, should God, would he, could he, possibly, should he? And we can go on forever, and we have done, haven't we? What do I do with questions like that? I have no ultimate answers, so I think of another question. And the other question is this. Whatever we go to along arguments like that, the fact is we live in a mixed world. We live in a world where we see wonderful flashes of good and kindness and friendship and compassion, even in the horror of a 9/11. But we see other things that go beyond. They're so excessive. By the time I'm finished this lecture, how many thousand children will have died from preventable diseases, but they had no medicines because they couldn't afford it? And that gives us a sense of proportion. So my question to you, and I'm coming to the end of my talk, ladies and gentlemen, is this. We can argue from now for years on what a good God could, should, would, might have done. But there's another question we can ask. Granted the universe is like this. There is good, there is evil, there is pain, there is beauty, there is hatred, there is love. Is there any evidence anywhere in the midst of it all that there is a God who can be trusted with it? Has God made provision big enough to cope with the fact that humans have gone their own way? I spoke to you that there's going to be a judgment. I'm going to have to face that judgment. It's not something we like to talk about. But that's because we don't see it in its true context. Who's going to be the judge? Now here I must speak as a Christian. One of the opportunities is in universities to listen to other worldviews. Please do. But I'm going to try to explain to you how Christianity copes with this. At least it's worth listening to, because atheism has no way out. You may think it's right or it's wrong, but at least listen to it and assess it. The heart of Christianity is a cross. And if Jesus is who he claimed to be, God become human, and now that goes way beyond our thinking. But I've written a great deal about those questions elsewhere. But just come to the central thing. Just imagine with me, if you can for a moment. The claim is that God suffered. That's spectacular, because do you know what it tells me? It tells me that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. I find that a little window that begins to open on a whole world of possibilities for meaning in my little life. Because the claim goes on to suggest that he suffered for me, who've made a mess of my life, who've got all these hurts and these pains. So sometimes, as some of our students sadly do, we commit suicide. Because it becomes too much. There's no way out. There's no source of meaning. Listen, ladies and gentlemen. Think this through. There is a source of deep and satisfying meaning, because the death of Christ was not the end. He rose from the dead. I believe that as a scientist. Miracles of this kind do not violate the laws of nature, because Jesus did not rise by natural processes occurring in his tomb 5 minutes before it occurred. He was raised by the very power of God. And that's what gives me hope. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I believe this is a moral universe. And people who suffered innocently will not perish for that ultimately. I'm going to say this, and please understand it comes from my heart. I really do believe that if I could see what God has done with people who've suffered innocently in natural disasters or under horrible moral evil, if I could see now what God has done with them, instead of having questions, I'd probably bow my head and worship. I believe that with all my heart. Otherwise, I wouldn't stand here for 1 minute. What am I saying? I believe that ultimately God knows how to compensate. Not find any of that in atheism. Is that pie in the sky when we die? Well, you'll have to decide that. What is the evidence? And you know, when we're really hurting, we need something to hold on to. I remember speaking to a man who was 7 years in solitary confinement in China for his faith. I said, "What kept you sane?" He said, "A sparrow that flew in through the grating of my prison cell high up," because he said I could see at least it was real and beautiful. And he said it held my faith in God for all those years that I was there. And so, as I listened to the names being read, and was moved myself to tears listening to a girl say, "Dad, you're my hero, happy birthday," on the birthday of her dad on 9/11, I thought, yes. All those people who read, almost all of them as far as I could see, burning in their hearts, was what resonates in the human soul. There's got to be hope somewhere. And there's hope in God. But then your university motto says it all. In tue lumine, videbimus lumen is the Latin version of it, by the way. In your light we shall see light. Do you know where that comes from? Listen. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light, Columbia University, in your light do we see light. And in the New Testament there is a very similar thing. When the Apostle Paul, who suffered greatly for his faith, is encouraging others, he says, "Look, share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began, and which now has been manifested through the appearing of our Savior Jesus Christ." Now listen to this. "Who abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel." On 9/11, ladies and gentlemen, let us determine that this year we're going to begin the search under the motto that led the people who set up this university to found it. Thank you very much indeed.
One of the questions that was pretty popular, when people suffer, people talk about God as a source of hope. How does that interface with actual evidence of God showing up, or is that just a projection of people's hopes?
Well, this is a very important question. It was raised famously by Sigmund Freud, who thought that the idea of God is a wish fulfillment, pie in the sky when we die, and I referred to it. There's a very interesting book been written by a German psychiatrist just recently. It's called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the great one, in which he says, if there is no God, then of course Freud could give you a wonderful explanation of how religion is an illusion, a delusion in fact, if there is no God. But of course, if there is a God, Freud will give you an equally good explanation of why atheism is a delusion. And he quotes Czesław Bykowski from Poland, who pointed out that the great opium of the people is atheism, the desire to avoid having to meet God. And the conclusion of this book is very interesting. He says, look, if there is no God, Freud's argument works against religion. If there is a God, it works against atheism. But on the question of whether there is a God or not, it can't help you at all. So we come to the question of evidence. And one of the questions, actually another one I think, Ashley, had to do with faith. And is faith blind? And do we just have to take a blind leap of faith? No, we certainly do not. Faith comes from the Latin word fides, which means, well, we get fidelity from it. It means trust. And you would be very foolish to trust someone else or trust a theory without evidence. And I'm firmly convinced that the Christian faith is based on evidence. So the question now boils down to this. What is God really like? Has he shown himself? Has he given evidence of what his heart is like? And the only way to find that out is to read, and if you've never read them as an adult, try. Read the Gospels. Start, say, with the Gospel of John. And watch Jesus at a funeral as he watches how, for example, death has torn a family apart. And one of the sisters who's been deprived of her brother through death is actually quite angry and gets all worked up and says, Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have had to die. And Jesus said, well, he'll rise again at the judgment. Yes, I know all that. And there was a terrific argument. The other sister came in and she stood weeping. And Jesus, what did he do? He wept too. And that story has always moved me to see. This is the heart of God, answering the woman's intellectual questions, Martha's intellectual questions, but sympathizing with Mary in her grief and weeping with her. And it's incidents like that, and the New Testament Gospels are full of them. And there's only one way to get to know them, is to read them with somebody else. I think, Ashley, you've mentioned that you do organize things like this. To get to see a picture of what the evidence is. You don't have to start by believing it or closing your eyes and taking a big jump of faith. Faith grows as it grows in human experience by getting to know someone. I didn't take a big leap of faith and marry my wife in the first millisecond that I knew her. No, it took time. And as I got to know her more and more, the trust grows. And it's exactly the same, I believe, with God. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, God is not a theory, he's a person. And he's revealed himself in terms that we can understand, a human person. Jesus Christ, who claims to be God incarnate. Now, I don't know whether that begins to answer your question, Ashley. You'll tell me if it doesn't.
Yeah, so, here at Columbia, we study, I guess freshmen, you haven't studied it yet, but after the Greek stuff, you'll get to the biblical stuff. And, just one of the strong impressions that, you get is you can't really trust these documents. So if that's the source of evidence, if someone doesn't trust those sources, what evidence do they have? Or why would you trust those sources?
Oh, this is immensely important. And it was a very important question for me as an undergraduate at Cambridge in the last century. It was one of the first questions I asked. And fortunately, we've got an enormous amount of evidence on the reliability of, for instance, let's just take the New Testament. One of the fascinating things is there have been people, historians, who've set out to disprove Christianity by showing that the details in the Gospel of Luke, for instance, and in the book of Acts, which is the first history of the Christian church, were wrong. And as Sir William Ramsay went round checking these things, he found that every single one of them was correct. Now, one of the very interesting things on this, your question comes straight from The God Delusion, really, by Richard Dawkins. And one of the fascinating things is that he gave an interview recently to Playboy. Now, I've got this secondhand. I didn't see it directly. But apparently he said there that the evidence for the historical existence of Jesus is very scant indeed. I find that staggering, because I've actually written a whole section of my recent book, Gunning for God, on this very thing. Because the existence or not of Jesus, to start with, is a matter of history. So who would you consult? Well, Dawkins quotes in his book either a professor of German or an anesthesiologist. He doesn't consult a single ancient historian. But I'm not a historian, so I do consult the historians. I cannot find a single leading ancient historian in the world, atheist or not, who would raise major questions about the existence of Jesus. And one of the staggering things, I met this with Christopher Hitchens himself, and Sam Harris says something similar, that the evidence for the existence of Jesus is thin. It isn't. The evidence for the New Testament documents is overwhelmingly better than the evidence for much of the classical literature that you'd study in this university. Caesar's Gallic Wars, I think the first document appears about 900 years after Caesar, and there are only 2 or 3 of them. For the Bible, we have documents going right back into the 1st century. And leading scholars who've studied these texts in ancient literature all their lives have come to the conclusion that the general authenticity of books like the histories of Luke and the book of Acts are among the highest standard of literary work that we've got. The point is, if this question bothers you, there's plenty of literature to help you answer it. And the test as to whether the question is real for you will be seen as to whether you study the literature, of course. But you know that, being Columbia students.
All right, so we have some great questions here. So Dr. Lennox likes to answer a few questions at a time, and this would be good because we have a lot of questions. So I'll just lay them out in front of you, and you can organize them. And some of these questions actually aren't that much about suffering, but we'll see how many we can get to.
Well, the first one that I can read, and you forgive me, it's not your writing, it's my eyesight and the darkness. Where does atheist morality come from? Now, that is a question that's being addressed at the moment particularly by Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape. And the argument up to now is that you cannot get an ought from an is. Hume's idea, Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher, said that there's no way in which you can get morality from isness. You can't get an ought from an is. And many philosophers and thinkers have agreed with that. Even Dawkins, up until recently, has said it's very difficult to see how you can get morality from science. Einstein famously said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. Now, Sam Harris believes he's overcome the problem. And in my recent book, I've actually dedicated part of a chapter to Sam Harris because I don't think he has overcome the problem. He simply smuggled the morality in at the beginning. Now, there are various possible sources. The evolutionary psychologists, the geneticists, try to get often morality from biology, but that creates problems, very obvious ones. For instance, to put it very crudely, Darwin was a nice chap, and he studied ants, and he saw that they cooperated, and he said, there you are, there you can get altruism, care for other people. Spencer saw nature very differently. He saw it as a struggle for the survival of the fittest. And we all know where that biological theory got when it was written into morality in the eugenics and the war crimes of the Nazis. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is if we remove the transcendence of God and try to get a morality from down in here, if you listen to the biological world, you can construct any morality you like. And that is why I think, if I might be so bold as to suggest it, there's so much moral confusion in the world today. But what is more, I want to say this. The question is, where do atheists get their morality from? Partly from the fact that they're human beings created in the image of God. That, to my mind, is the explanation for the staggering commonality of core morality around the world. Now, I know there are various differences, how many people you can marry and all the rest of it, but the core things, honesty, truth, respect for old people and so on, you find them all around the world. This has been documented. C.S. Lewis wrote a whole list. Indeed, you can find the golden rule, love your neighbors yourself, in every major philosophy, in every major religion, including Roman pagan religion. It's there. Now, where does it come from? Well, from where I sit, it's because you and I are dignified not only by having free will, but by being made in the image of God. And that's why, whether you believe in God or not, you will come up with a very similar morality. And that, we ought to be thankful for that, because it's the only basis on which society has any chance of surviving. So that's the first one. Do you want me to go on to another one here?
I'll ask one follow-up, I remember.
There is a very
yeah,
relevant
you got
one.
it right there. Good.
Do atheists have the capacity to do good? Of course they do. Of course they do. Ladies and gentlemen, this is very important. When I say that there's no foundation, rational foundation for morality in atheism, that is by far and away not saying that atheists cannot be moral. Some of my atheist friends can put me to shame. Many an atheist has a higher standard, sadly, than many a professing Christian or religious person. Why is that? Well, I go back to my same answer. It's because we're all human beings made in the image of God. So I would tremble if I thought that anybody went away thinking that atheists cannot do good. Of course they can, and they're often in the forefront of doing good. Do I proceed?
Keep on going.
Why is your God more valid than Thor, Zeus, and all the rest of them, and hundreds of thousands of other gods that humans have invented since the beginning of humanity? Well, that's a very interesting thing. Richard Dawkins put that to me. He says, you know, you're an Azucist. I said, what does that mean? He said, you're an atheist with regard to Zeus. And I said, that's exactly right. And he said, so am I. Well, he said, I just go one God further than all the rest of them, and I'm an atheist. So there's no difference. I said, yes, there is. I said, I notice you've written a 400-page book on atheism, but not a 400-page book on Azucism, Thorism, Wotanism, and anything elseism. Why is that? Now, that is a very important question. The difference, of course, is a question of evidence again. I know no other way to approach these questions. What is the evidence for the existence of Zeus? The Greeks themselves, particularly Xenophanes, I hope you read Xenophanes in your classical studies, who was the marvelous man who got the Freudian argument centuries before Freud, and said, you know, the Thracians like horses. No, if horses had gods, they would invent them in the form of horses and so on. Now, the one major thing that distinguishes the biblical God is that Genesis, that starts to talk to us about God, doesn't fit into the genre of myth at all. It's a protest against myth. The Greek gods, as was well known, were a deification of the forces of nature. And if you want to understand the real difference between Greek, Babylonian, Egyptian gods and the Judeo-Christian God, read Werner Jaeger's book on the Greek gods. And he says the profound difference is this, that the gods of the ancients, all of them came from within space-time. They actually were, many of them, products of a primeval soup, which in the Babylonian case they called Ur-Nammu. That is, they are part of the space-time continuum, whereas the biblical God transcends space-time. That is a phenomenal difference. And of course, it's why there have been millions of books written defending the Christian faith, the monotheistic faiths, as distinct from defending Thor. So there's a massive difference, it seems to me. So that's just the start of an answer to that question. But since there are other questions, I better go on to them. Do we really have free will over our lives if God is omniscient? He knows the past, present, and future. Well, of course we do. But you say, explain that. That's a bit more difficult. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm not really embarrassed. Can you tell me what time is? No? What's energy? Well, we don't know. We can use it, measure it. We don't know what it is. What is consciousness? We don't know what it is. And what we don't know is God's relationship to time. Sometimes people talk about God as, well, he knows everything. He knows past, present, and future. But that is causation. Well, even a simple human analogy. I'm living in a hotel overlooking Ground Zero. And I can see from my room 2 perpendicular streets meeting. I could see cars coming down both those streets who can't see each other. I could predict a collision, even though each of them is freely in control of their vehicle. Now, that's only a trivial analogy. And it seems to me that this question, which has been debated by philosophers, really circles around the fact of God's relationship to time. Now remember, when Jesus was in the world, he said a very startling thing. In fact, something that classifies him as a lunatic if it isn't true. He said, before Abram was, I am. What? I mean, think about it. In other words, he was claiming to be eternally present. So he does see everything. Is that causative? I don't think so. And I don't think you think so, because in the heart of our hearts, the thing that imparts dignity to us, and the Bible spends page after page pointing out to us that the essence of our response to God is freely chosen. Otherwise, it would be of no value. God loves the world. He's demonstrated his love on a cross. Can we say no? Yes, we can say no. And when God himself turned up in a village and the people said, we don't want you, he went. So it's very important, I think, to realize that we do have that freedom. Now, there was another part, to be fair to that questioner, who will say, you missed out the first part of my question. First part of the question, in the Bible, God commands his people, the Israelites, to destroy other nations. Why does God do that? Now, that is actually a major question. And it's a question, again, that if you want to follow, forgive the personal reference, but I've devoted a whole chapter of it, of my book, Gunning for God, to this very thing. This is a question that disturbs us. It disturbs me. How can it be that the God who talks, and I read it to you from the Old Testament, this isn't the New Testament, about the God of steadfast love, how could he command anything like this? Well, here's how I begin to approach it. Firstly, the record of this happening doesn't occur in some obscure part of the Bible. It occurs in one of the most moralistic books in the whole Bible, the book of Deuteronomy. In other words, the very morality which people use to say, well, God, you must be evil if you did this, the very morality they're using to condemn those acts occurs in the very book that records those acts. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is that God doesn't appear to be ashamed of what happened. Because what the Bible claims, now here again, you may agree with it or disagree with it, but if a question is asked about the Bible, we've got to at least listen to its rationale. We may decide to reject it or accept it. That book of Deuteronomy contains the first humanitarian rules of war. It contains the first rules for preserving the environment. They are very remarkable. And yet, in this instance, it appears at first sight that something very different is happening, that God commands the Israelites to deal with particular tribes. Were they any tribes? No, they weren't. For 400 years, they had been cumulatively perpetrating the most hideous of evils, including the horror of child sacrifice. And God decided to judge them. Now, before we rush in to criticize God, you might think at a much lower level that people took issue with the Nazis, didn't they? And with Stalin, and with Mao. And God deals with people in history at the stage that they were at. And so it seems to me, firstly, that there was a specific reason that was so strong in terms of judging evil that the Bible stands behind it. That's point number one. Point number two, the language that's used, we have to look at very carefully. Because when you first read it, if you don't know the way in which the ancient Hebrews used your language, you would think everybody was massacred, nobody was left. But it's obvious from the history, even within the Bible, that that didn't happen. So much so that a leading scholar, Nicholas Waltersdorf, he's in America here, argues that these formulaic things, go and destroy them all, actually mean have a significant victory. And he himself does not think that the rules of war were violated in them. So there are ways of approaching these things. But I still have a problem with it. I still have a problem with it. Because whatever you think of what happened in the Old Testament, we of course are not living in Old Testament days now, and many things have changed, though not the nature of God. But whatever the answer to this problem is, I'm faced with the fact that thousands of kids died of disease since the beginning of my lecture. I'm faced with that. And so are you. Now, if there is a God, he must have allowed that to happen, mustn't he? And that brings me back to this question. Now, a lot of it, I'm afraid, starvation is caused by exploitation. They're not just natural disasters. They're a mixture of natural and moral evil. And we could spend a lot of time going into that. And it brings us round again, inevitably, to the question that hovers in the background here, which is the question we cannot avoid, the question of judgment, and will it be done fairly? And there again, I can only say what God has revealed through Christ on the cross. This is the nature of God. And he has revealed to us, God so loved the world, is the biggest statement of God's love in the whole of the New Testament, that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And in the end, I do believe the evidence of the New Testament, the evidence of experience, the evidence of moral intuition, all points and converges in one direction. That our morality doesn't mock us, and therefore, in the end, there must be justice. The evidence? Well, the evidence is that God has appointed the judge and shown whom he has appointed by raising him from the dead historically. So in the end, for me, a lot of the evidence has to do with the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
So what is the value of suffering, and what purpose does it serve? And we actually got a few times in the surveys that people said, I believe everything happens for a reason. Would you comment on that? Because I think that logic could be, taken further.
Yes, I sympathize with the question, but I feel it's probably too simplistic. Is there value in suffering? Yes, in some suffering there is. Dostoevsky once wrote, didn't he, in one of his novels, that he couldn't imagine a great person who hadn't suffered. And there's something about pain at the first level that does something to people. I believe you have a game in this country called football. It's not quite the same as ours. I've noticed that the people that get involved in it, well, actually, I watched it once and I tried to make sense of it, but it goes beyond my brain. It is so complex. And then I decided, I know what it is. I've got a definition of American football. It's a series of prayer meetings interrupted by war. Well, isn't that right? They go down in a huddle and then they get up and bash each other. But have you noticed that those big guys will endure enormous pain? And they don't regard that as anything. It's part of the thing to build up your muscles and your strength and so on. And it's true, if you don't exercise, you won't develop. Pain also acts as an enormously good warning system. It's very dangerous for a person who doesn't feel pain to go near a fire because they won't sense when they're being burnt. So there are all those valuable things. And we all know as well that suffering in limited amounts can develop character. The Bible says it does for the Christian. It does for ordinary people as well. And we look up to people when we look at our own troubles, and then we see somebody else who's major troubles. I was just amazed watching the Paralympics. I don't know whether you saw them over here. People with no legs or no arms running absolutely full of the joys of life. And it is just amazing what people can cope with. Do you know there's research been done, particularly in this country, academic research on two things: lottery winners and people who've had serious accidents. And lottery winners get a lot of money, they're euphoric for a little while, and then they descend in general into an average deep misery. Whereas people who have a serious accident involving disabled maybe have an initial immense misery, but then they gradually come up to, now listen to this. I could scarcely believe this when I read it, but this is the evidence. They come up to the same level of happiness as if they were fully able. And a study in the University of Illinois, just recently, by David Myers, revealed there was no difference on any indices between able-bodied students and disabled students in terms of happiness. So people can bear a lot. They can develop character. But the trouble with this, and this may be the way you were going to go with the question, Ashley, is there comes a point when pain seems beyond all comprehension. And that's where I begin to say, no, there's a limit to this. And I'm backed up by that in the fact that the Bible tells me there is a world where there will be no pain. There will be no crying. And one of the most beautiful statements comes near the end of the Bible where it says, God will wipe away every tear from their eye. Do you ever notice that you rarely wipe away somebody else's tears? Why is that? Because the eye is very sensitive. And if you try to wipe somebody else's tears, you're apt to hurt their eye. What an image it is of God. How interested is God in me? Well, I believe in a God, ladies and gentlemen, who will, if I put it metaphorically, wield the last handkerchief and wipe away the final tear from my eye. That is a magnificent vision. And if there is in that world to come to be no pain and no dying, we may know that pain, whatever useful purpose it may serve. And the story of Job in the Old Testament, which was one of the great stories of Hebrew literature, possibly the earliest book written in the Bible, is the story of a man who suffered and yet didn't reject God, even though he didn't know why he was suffering. So that's the way I begin to approach that. But probably I've wandered away from your question.
You know, that's all right. So this is the last question, and this is the question that there's a lot of interest in. So last year there was an article that one of the students wrote, I think at Harvard, about their struggle with suicide, with depression, and immediately there was a response at Columbia, and over 100 people posted just comments identifying with that. And again, I think it was this past week, a few days ago, someone posted another article at Harvard, and there were instantly 1,000 views on depression and suicide. So what resources does your worldview give to something where it's psychological, it seems ongoing? Many people have seen therapists for months, for years, and haven't seen much progress. Yeah, so that's the last question.
Well, that's a hard question, isn't it? I'll never forget my last day at Cambridge. A student came to us and said, well, I've had a great time. I'm out to shoot myself now. We all laughed. In the evening, he was found dead. That was a very sobering experience for me. So I'll try and approach this humbly. Why do people take their own lives? My heart goes out to them. Often it's because, and they leave notes behind, if they do leave notes behind, I have nothing to live for. Or it's all meaningless. Now, when you say, does my worldview have resources to offer? Yes, it does. But we've got to take them gently, one at a time. And it goes back to where I started with the left brain, the right brain. We've been so educated that we analyze, we take things apart, that we forget that we need to build things up. We need a big picture. We need a meta-narrative into which to insert ourselves. And the first major question is, who am I as a human being? What am I? And there the views compete. The atheistic materialist worldview says, well, you are simply the end product of mindless, unguided processes. You are without meaning. And I sense that a lot of the incidence of suicide comes about from people being taught that and then beginning to believe it. Well, the wonderfully good news is, whoever you think you are of infinite value because you're made in the image of God. If you read the Bible, you'll discover the heavens declare the glory of God. And if you could see the heavens tonight, and I'm an amateur astronomer and love looking up at the sky, the heavens show the glory of God, but they weren't made in his image. You were. Now, even that fact, to get a hold of what the doctrine of creation means in practice, not all the theories about creation, but if it's true that God is behind the universe, and if what the Bible claims is true, then what it's telling you is magnificent. You, me, with all my hang-ups, with all my difficulties, with all my problems, with all my defects, both mental, physical, and so on, we've all got them to some degree. You're made in the image of God. That's number one. And that begins to help give us a worldview that is very different from the bleak emptiness of atheism. Dawkins once admitted to me that his atheism was very bleak. And he says, of course, that doesn't prove it's false. Well, I said, of course it doesn't, but it doesn't prove it's true either. And so what it's good to do, if you're in these questionings, is to simply, without saying yes or no, simply to expose yourself to the Christian worldview, to see what it actually says before you make up your mind about it. Take your time, ask your questions. Because the next level of this, and I'm going to close now because this is such a big and important question. Your status as a human being is that you are more significant than the moon or the sun. Do you know, they don't know you exist, you know it exists, don't you? It was not made in God's image, you were. But secondly, and I'm not ashamed to say this, even as a professor from Oxford, God loves you. And another reason for committing suicide is the feeling of not being loved, that nobody cares. And it's hard for some whose parents may have abused them, who've never known a father's love or a mother's love, to wrestle with these things. And so what I'd recommend you do is to read some of the ways in which the Bible tries to get to our hearts. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. Those kind of poems in the Psalms that have comforted millions of people. And then the New Testament, when we see what Jesus was like, what he did, how he sympathized with people, his humility, his love, his care for the despised, the outcasts, and so on, we begin to build up a picture. His disciples were such a rough crew of people you wouldn't believe. And yet he loved them, and he proved that he loved them. It wasn't just sentiment. He went to a cross for them. We can all have deep and dark thoughts. We all go down and up depending on our temperament. Now, I can't prove this to you because in the end, ladies and gentlemen, the only way to understand what a relationship is to enter it. We can discuss abstractly what God is this and that and the other, but the only way that I will ever get to know you is if you reveal yourself to me and I start talking to you. The only way you'll ever get to know God is by saying, God, if there is a God, please show yourself to me and I'll open myself up to you. And only take the steps that you feel are rationally justified to take. Because I firmly believe that this statement is true. He that seeks, she that seeks, will find. And Jesus issues this magnificent invitation. Come unto me, he says, all you who are weak and burdened and heavily laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, and you will find rest unto your souls. Is it real? The only way you can find out is to begin to take those steps. Ask your questions. Discuss with others who've already entered this relationship. And in my past experience for 60 years, I've got to know a God who, even when in that day I said goodbye to my wife, I still trusted him for it. I haven't known suffering like some of you and some of my friends who've lost all their relatives. I haven't known that. But at the level in which I begin to understand these things, I've met people who've been in all these situations and who still will say, like so many people did today as they read those names, of the loved ones they'd lost through a cruel act of terrorism, that they still believed in God. Thank you very much for being so patient. It's been lovely to be with you, and good night.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.